Hello, you fucks. Welcome to John Solo's Beard Brigade. I'm John Solo. You are not, and honestly, I've never met another John Solo, so I think it's just me. I met Han Solo. Actually, I haven't met him, but he's a Union brother of mine, as you know. We're kind of like that, you know. Anyways, today we are working on little Patty Logan's Prosper Woods Wolves Book 2, The Flower Moon. Many a person is going to be deflowered. You understand as well, when I record these things, normally I'm recording and I'm streaming into Discord live at the same time, and something very special just happened. See, people get levels in Discord. They level up, and there's a little gag that we run. But someone very special to me, very near and dear to my heart, the only Brit I've ever met with straight teeth, her name is Emma. She's around today in the crowd. It's our Queen Emma. We love her to death, and she just got level 52. Congratulations, Emma. You just got to level 52. You've already seen my cape closet. You don't need to pay any more, and I've already shown you something gross. At this point, what more can I offer you but a big steaming plate full of... Wow. Jesus, Harry Christ, it's alive! Sorry about that, guys. I had to give Emma her level. Anyways, welcome to Storytime. Fresh back from our YouTube ban, we are starting out right. We're working on little Patty Logan's book here. Here's the cover. Notice that
Pain us.
Notice she, in fact, got Michael Dean to do the cover. Jesus Christ, I'm on a roll today. Anyways, today we're working on Prosper Woods Wolves Book 2. This is one of my favorite series of all time. Prosper Woods Chronicles is one of the best things ever. I love the jokes at the beginning of each chapter. They're fantastic. This one is even better than that. And Book 2 we've really been looking forward to. Now, rumor has it this may be the final book in this series. Now, I don't know whether that's going to be the actual case or not. I've heard authors say that before. This is literally the reverse problem of like the George R.R. Martin Game of Thrones thing. Like, these authors are very prolific, and little Patty Logan works her ass off. But she is moving on to something else for a little bit at least. So this is the last of Prosper Woods Wolves that we're going to get for a while. Now, there are no spoilers in this. If you've made it this far into the series, you know who everyone is. We're continuing the story of Castor and Emery. And what we're working on today is what you're about to hear is chapter 1. There's a prologue before it. I strongly suggest if you can read or listen to the other books beforehand, but if not, you can kind of jump into these things too. There's a lot happening, but you'll still be able to have fun and keep up. I'm going to read you the summary here of the book. Seriously, Michael Dean has done a lot of covers. An old-fashioned breeches ripper with a tooth and claw twist. I'm worried about Emery. War is coming to Prosper Woods, and I would do anything to prevent it. The last thing I planned was to start a war, but when I rejected Penelope McCurdy, breaking our betrothal, I should have known her father, clan leader Alistair McCurdy, with a Scottish accent, wouldn't let it go. He's promised to wipe out my clan and kill everyone I've ever loved, but I won't let that happen. Most of all, I'm not about to let anyone harm Emery, my precious mate. I'd lay down my life to protect him or put my fist in his butt. I'm worried about Castor. Mother Nature has blessed me with a beautiful man, but ever since our mating, our home in Prosper Woods hasn't felt safe. I know Castor loves me, and though he doesn't show any outward signs of concern, even I can sense Alistair McCurdy's, with the Scottish accents, threats are eating away at him. The last thing I want to do is to distract him from what he and our allies are planning. When tragedy suddenly strikes our happy home, we both realize we're much more vulnerable than we thought. The world as we may know it. No, the world as we... It's the end of the world as we... It may be ending. Join Castor and Emery in the stunning conclusion to the Prosper Woods Wolves as they find themselves backed into a corner with no way out. So, that's a summary. What you're going to hear is chapter 1. Again, it's right after the prologue in this book. And please understand that this is a fly-in-the-wall situation. You're watching a live recording session. There will be plenty of fuck-ups in this, trust me, because there's a lot of foreign words. Turns out the little Patty Logan has some connection to Persians. I don't know if she sells rugs on the side of a freeway or what, but there's a lot of that shit going on in this book. Tracy will be jumping in and correcting me. I'm not really paying any attention to the camera per se, but understand that I do film live for Discord for all my sessions. So if I talk to people, that's what you're hearing. So enjoy, have fun. I love you fucks. I will catch you on the next go-around. Chapter 1. Prosper Woods Chronicle, all the advice fit to print. Dear Crabby, my granny likes to knit designs into her sweaters, and lately I've noticed her projects are becoming thematically dark. I don't know what it is. She's given up knitting puppies and kittens and switched to depictions of bloody knives and horses' heads. How normal is it to have to buy truckloads of red yarn in order to get ready for Christmas? Signed, a loving granddaughter. Dear, a loving granddaughter, if you don't want the theme of this year's ugly sweater party to be the red wedding, you need to move fast. First, hide her bifocals. And if that doesn't work, strategically place her cat's hot, wet hairballs in the middle of the carpet on the way to her restroom. This will cause her to step on them, squeal, jump back, fall, and break her hip. And if you're lucky, the family just might escape those knitting needles alive after all. Respectfully, Crabby. And so begins the journey into the twisted mind of Patty Logan. Respectfully, Crabby. Emery. Just to satisfy myself here because it just did not feel right, I'm going to double check his voice from the previous book real quick. Archives, audiobook.
Basically wide-eyed innocence who isn't innocent anymore.
Yeah, it seems like I was pulling the innocence off a lot more than my portrayal in the pre-production. Chapter 13. Prosper Woods Chronicle, all the advice. A split second later, cold rushed in, and I found myself lying on the dirt floor of the mine as a high-pitched snarl, then a howl of rage, blood loss. Like missing pieces, more memory. That's right. I kind of have that wide-eyed in. That's a great way to put it. All right, I've got it now.
Wide-eyed innocent Fry.
Respectfully, Crabby. Emery. I held on to Castor's hand as we drove to Vincent Lasco's house. I knew that the invite to lunch with him and his mate Rome was a pretext for a discussion of the changes coming to our small little town of Prosper Woods, but that didn't matter. I liked the Unicorn King and his mate, King of the Vampires, and I was determined to keep the meal conversation light. Things back home at the inn had been tense ever since my mate had rejected Alistair McCurdy's daughter, but honestly, as sorry as I felt for the girl, I couldn't deny how incredibly lucky I felt to be Castor's one and only, his fated mate. Where do they live? Castor turned my way and smiled. My heart squeezed in my chest every time he did that. When I'd first met the prince in the foyer of the inn, I'd been in awe of him. In most ways, I still was. My mate was big and powerfully built, a trait common to the werewolf aristocracy. In the past, I'd found all direwolf aristocrats to be haughty and full of themselves, with their foppish clothing and their snooty and entitled ways. My best friend Claudio and I had never found it difficult to mock them. Castor was entirely different from any aristocrat I'd ever met. At that first meeting, I realized he wasn't a happy person. The twin sense of despair and hopelessness practically cloaked him. Now I knew why. He'd been forced into an engagement with a female so that he would have sons to take over the throne. Thank God we'd discovered each other that day. And thank God we were still alive to talk about it. Lasco has a cabin not far from his antique store in town. That would be Castor. Fine, I'll do the right voice. Just get off my back, all right? Okay. And thank God we were still alive to talk about it. Lasco has a cabin not far from his antique store in town. I understand his mate was given a cabin as part of his employment with the sheriff's office when he first came to town, but at some point, Rome gave the use of the cabin to Alpha Greg Brown and Sam. Castor replied, I've never been inside, but I know where it is. You can smell the vampire from a mile away, love. I frowned just a little. Why did he do that? I don't have all the details, but when I first moved to town, Floyd Reardon, the former Pack Alpha, was the biggest troublemaker around. At some point he burned down Greg and Sam's cabin, so Rome moved them into his, and he simply took up residence with the vampire. He squeezed my hand, and I frowned just a little as he turned his eyes back to the road. Sweetheart, I said, you should call him Vincent, not
Stop.
the vampire. You know you should call him Vincent.
Yes,
It's all right.
that.
Take a drink of water, you're fine. Turned his eyes back to the road.
Also, I wanted to
Sweetheart,
tell you something else.
I said.
I goofed. The where does he live should have been Emery. I
don't
know
what
it's
you're
so far
saying.
back.
Well, I don't know what you're saying, so tell me what to do.
I'm saying when you had Castor say, where does he live, talking about Vincent, that should have been Emery.
I'm trying to find it in the manuscript here.
Come on, go back.
Where do they live? Okay. The top
Yes,
of page
that.
14. All right, cool. It's all right. Give me a minute. You just get to hear more, that's all. Now I knew why. Where do they live? All right. This should be Emery.
Indeed. Sorry, I goofed.
It's all right. It's not your fault. Felt to be Castor's one and only, his fated mate. Where do they live? Castor turned my way and smiled. My heart squeezed in my chest every time he did that. When I'd first met the prince in the foyer of the inn, I'd been in awe of him. In most ways, I still was. My mate was big and powerfully built, a trait common to the werewolf aristocracy. In the past, I'd found all direwolf aristocrats to be haughty and full of themselves, with their foppish clothing and their snooty and entitled ways. My best friend Claudio and I had never found it difficult to mock them. Castor was entirely different from any aristocrat I'd ever met. At that first meeting, I realized he wasn't a happy person. The twin sense of despair and hopelessness practically cloaked him. Now I knew why. He'd been forced into an engagement with a female so that he would have sons to take over the throne. Thank God we'd discovered each other that day, and thank God we were still alive to talk about it. Lasco has a cabin not far from his antique store in town. I understand his mate was given a cabin as a part of his employment with the sheriff's office when he first came to town. But at some point, Rome grew to... Lasco has a cabin not far from his antique store in town. I understand his mate was given a cabin as part of his employment with the sheriff's office when he first came to town, but at some point, Rome gave the use of the cabin to Alpha Greg Brown and Sam. Castor replied, I've never been inside, but I know where it is. You can smell the vampire from a mile away, love. I frowned just a little. Why did he do that? I don't have all the details, but when I first moved to town, Floyd Reardon, the former Pack Alpha, was the biggest troublemaker around. At some point he burned down Greg and Sam's cabin, so Rome moved them into his, and he simply took up residence with the vampire. He squeezed my hand, and I frowned just a little as he turned his eyes back to the road. Sweetheart, I said, you know you should call him Vincent, not the vampire. I made air quotes with my fingers. It makes you sound like you don't like him, and even though you pretend not to, you like both of them. Why all the pretense? Castor snorted, smirking but not looking at me as he drove the black Range Rover down the road. This is why I love you. You see me. It was my turn to snort out a laugh. Yes, I see you. Right now I see that you're trying to pretend you're not friends with the king of vampires and his mate. You didn't answer the question. Why do you pretend not to like him? Castor let out a deep sigh, sobering as he stared out the windshield. Back in the old country, we fought vampires. They were our mortal enemies. When I met this one, I was cautious as I should have been. When he turned out to be no threat and offered his hand in friendship, I took it. That doesn't mean it feels normal to be friends with a man who lives on blood and roams the night. They turned to look at me and sighed. But I admit, he's a good guy. Castor shrugged. What else is there to say? I'm friends with a fucking vampire. What else is there to say? I'm friends with a fucking vampire. I laughed and leaned over to kiss his cheek. He kept his eyes on the road, but bent so I could reach him over the center console where our Starbucks coffees were. Ever since the chain store coffee shop moved into town a month back, Castor had been making regular trips over to Main Street to pick up one for each of us at least once a day. Who knew werewolves loved coffee so much? Back home, my mother had raised me on proper Persian chai. Is that how you say that, chai? Never did know.
It is.
Look at that. I lucked out. Back home, my mother had raised me on proper Persian chai, a fancy word for fragrant tea. It was delicious, and ever since Mrs. Douglas, the inn's head cook, learned of my desire for it, she made sure a pot was sent up every morning to start my day with Castor's coffee. I loved how she'd welcomed me to the inn. Castor, I know you're going to want to talk town business when you get there, but will you promise to keep it until after lunch? I just want one meal with our friends that doesn't turn into a conversation about how to assimilate an influx of wolves from Tabriz and the vampires Vincent has welcomed to town. Can you wait until the pudding course? Castor darted a glance toward me before looking back at the road. He nodded. Yes, my love, I can wait until after lunch to bring up town issues. All right, Mr. Beck.
I love you too. Ashekatam Azizam.
Ashekatam?
Ashekatam.
Ashekatam. All right. My love, I can wait until after lunch to bring up town issues. Ashekatam Azizam. Is that all right?
Patty?
Oh, I don't know. Patty's off doing her own thing. She's only sitting in here because, she's paying me and shit. Exactly. See? Trace, you are in charge. Do not defer to the author unless the author jumps in and says, you're wrong. Other than that, you're in charge. Exactly. Listen to this and see if it sounds like I'm not embarrassing you. Ashekatam Azizam. Perfect. Thank you, Patty. And yeah, Trace, you the chick. You in charge. Make sense? I'm not waving like this at you. Lunch to bring up town issues. Ashekatam Azizam. I loved it when my mate told me he loved me in our native language. I sighed and relaxed back into the comfortable black leather seat. Thank you, Castor. I studied his handsome profile for a minute. My mate had very dark hair with lighter highlights. He was more than half a foot taller than my 5'8" frame and built like a brick house. From head to foot, I adored him. The rest of the drive was made in silence, but it was a comfortable quiet which served to relax me. Of course, the fact that he never let go of my hand was a big reason why. Werewolves are tactile creatures. Besides our ability to smell nearly everything on a person, I quickly learned that fated mates have even more sensitive scent glands. Ever since our mating...
Fated mates had.
Reason why. Werewolves are tactile creatures. Besides our ability to smell nearly everything on a person, I quickly learned that fated mates had even more sensitive scent glands. Ever since our mating, I could pick up emotions on a person or another wolf. If they blocked me from reading their mind, I could still learn a lot about them because of my enhanced abilities. I kind of loved my new superpower. Castor slowed down and turned off the highway onto a narrow dirt road. We plunged deep into the forest, and as the darkness of the trees surrounded the car, the sense of several unfamiliar vampires hit my nostrils. I immediately looked at Castor and noted his deep frown, which hadn't been present a minute ago. "Smell that?" I asked. He turned to look at me. "No matter what you do, don't let go of my hand. Do you understand, Emery? I need to know you're safe and close at all times." I nodded vigorously. "Yes. Okay, my mate." When we pulled up to the cabin and parked on the drive, I noted several vehicles. One was a large van with a satellite dish on top. The logo on the side was for something called VNN, and I wondered what that was. On the porch, Romeo and Vincent stood, speaking to another man, while others rolled up long orange extension cords. Several people were packing up what looked like large cameras on tripods, and others took down another man while others rolled up long orange extension cords. Several people were packing up what looked like large cameras on tripods, and others took down a large screen which had been set up on the front lawn. Whatever had been going on here seemed to be finished, at least for the day. As we parked and got out, the smell of vampire became overwhelming to the point of distraction, especially when everyone, to a man, turned to look at us. Castor grabbed my hand as Vincent appeared in front of us. 1 second on the porch, the next standing beside us on the driveway. I blinked, noting how the motion was little more than a blur. I blinked, noting how the motion was little more than a blur. "Sorry, didn't mean to startle you," he apologized as Castor and I both let out a warning growl. I got it. Blur. "Sorry, didn't mean to startle you," he apologized as Castor and I both let out warning growls. "I thought they'd be gone before you arrived." Castor looked down his nose at Vincent, who was a few inches taller than I, but not as tall as my mate. "You could have warned me. I wasn't expecting to roll up on a house full of vampires." He glanced around the yard before returning his gaze to Vincent's. "Who are they?" He looked up, and I followed his line of sight to the thick, dark clouds. When Castor looked back down, he was wearing a smirk. "How is it that vampires can walk around during the day?" Vincent smiled. "The clouds. They can't stay out very long, but as long as we have dark cloud cover, they can move around." He gestured to the yard. "I'm sorry. The timing's a little off." It's difficult having both of them in a scene. "Cloud cover. They can move around." He gestured to the yard. "I'm sorry. The timing's a little off. They're a camera crew from the old country. They're here to film me and introduce me to the rest of the vampire world via the Vampire News Network." Tiago felt that aside from the
Stop.
Tiago.
Mm-hmm.
Introduce me to the rest of the vampire world via the Vampire News Network. Introduce me to the rest of the vampire world via the Vampire News Network. Tiago felt that aside from the proclamations and laws I've been passing, introduce me to the rest of the vampire world via the Vampire News Network. Tiago felt that aside from the proclamations and laws I've been passing, the vampire public needs to put introduce me to the rest of the vampire world via the Vampire News Network. Tiago felt that aside from the proclamations and laws I've been passing, the vampire public needs to put a face to the name of their king. As you will soon find out. Sorry, my stomach's going batshit. Vampire public needs to put a face to the name of their king. As you will soon find out, restructuring a seat of power that has been in place for centuries is a serious and often fatiguing operation. Thank goodness Scott Templeton knows what he's doing at the antique store. I've been glad to spend almost no time there since I dissolved the Conclave of Eight. Castor
stuff
nodded.
I've been able to spend.
Thank goodness Scott Templeton knows what he's doing at the antique store. I've been able to spend almost no time there since I dissolved the Conclave of Eight. Castor nodded. Yes, I can only imagine how difficult that is. So these folks are here from the Vampire News Network. VNN, yes, Vincent said. They were just leaving. And they know the town is full of werewolves? I asked. I had no idea who this Thiago person was, but he clearly was someone intimate with the vampire world, possibly a vampire whom Vincent trusted. Vincent turned my way and smiled, sketching a quick bow. Yes, they do, Emery. It's nice to see you here. They turned to look at the man standing on the porch with Rome. The vampire was looking in our direction. Vincent turned back to us. Let me go and wish them a good afternoon. I'm looking forward to sitting down to lunch, but that won't be happening unless Romeo gets the barbecue started soon. By all means. That would probably be Castor. That won't be happening unless Romeo gets the barbecue started soon. By all means. We'll wait right here. Vincent turned and was gone in the blink of an eye. A split second later, he stood on the porch, holding out a hand to the stranger who seemed to be very young. I totally didn't do that in first person. By all means, we'll wait right here. Vincent turned and was gone in the blink of an eye. A split second later, he stood on the porch holding out a hand to the stranger who seemed to be very young. He was a vampire, so I had no idea how old he was, though. He looked stood on the porch holding out a hand to the stranger who seemed to be very young. He was a vampire, so I had no idea how old he was, though he looked to be no older than mid-20s. He was dressed in an exceedingly flamboyant purple velvet suit with bell-bottoms and white frills that stuck out from between wide lapels and poked out below his cuffs. He wore high-heeled shoes with a rounded toe and glasses with thick black frames. Oh, my God. If it hadn't been for the man's exceedingly long curly hair, I realized I was looking at Austin Powers, or a near-perfect look-alike. I frowned and turned to look up at Castor as he looked down at me. Is it possible? He began. That's Austin Powers, I snorted. I watched as Vincent and the vampire laughed, and then all three men headed down the porch steps and began walking across the lawn at human speed. When Rome, Vincent, and the man stopped in front of us, I ignored the stranger and turned to the sheriff, holding out my hand. King Rome, I said, bowing a little. Please call me Rome, the sheriff said. How are you, Emery? I shook the Unicorn King's hand. From the moment I'd first seen him in his shifted form playing Twister in the forest, I'd liked the man. I mean, how many kings out there actually thought it would be worth their time to play games with their mate, their son, and their son's guardians? King Rome and King Vincent really were special people, and I was glad we were on good terms with them. Not only were we going to war soon, but having the vampires and shifters in our camp was as important as having Alpha Brown's Frederick pack of werewolves at our side. We really were quite lucky. I'm good. Now that the McCurdy clan has gone home, things are better. That doesn't mean I'm complacent. I glanced at Castor when he squeezed my hand. He was the first to break our gaze as he looked at the stranger and held out his hand. How do you do? I'm Castor Howard. The Austin Powers look-alike took his hand, smiling and showing off a mouth full of massive teeth. I wondered how he squeezed a set of fangs in there among all the square choppers. Prince Castor! Oh, yeah, baby, the vampire said with open admiration. If I hadn't just watched Austin Powers with Claudio, I would have been taken aback by the familiar way in which the vampire spoke to a prince of the first house. How do we say his name? DeLeo?
DeLeo. George DeLeo.
Back by the familiar way in which the vampire spoke to a prince of the first house. George DeLeo, publicist extraordinaire. Castor shook his hand, staring at him open-mouthed until the man let go of his hand and turned to me. So you're the little brown commoner who stole the prince's heart. I'm completely missing that shit. I'm going to listen to
Yeah,
it.
I was thinking you were actually on point.
You think it's all right? Because I'm not sounding like Austin Powers, but I am sounding like a flamboyant, gay British man. Which really, I guess that's... What's the word where you say... I mean, flamboyant and gay and British all... I could probably just say British.
Ouch.
All right, let's just work it the way I'm going to work it. Staring at him open-mouthed until the man let go of his hand and turned to me. So you're the little brown commoner who stole the prince's heart. What a story. You must let me tell it. I took the hand he thrust out in my direction, at a loss as to what I could possibly say to this strange vampire. Thank you, I muttered as he shook my hand and went on. I understand your mate gave that old Alistair McCurdy the boot. How I wish I could have been a fly on the wall when the Scot threatened royal werewolves with war. I understand you handled the threat as smoothly as jizz sliding off a dolphin's back. What? Castor said, looking and sounding just as confused as I must have. What? Vincent. Castor said, looking and sounding just as confused as I must have. What Mr. DeLeo is trying to say is that he has no shame saying whatever he wants to, Vincent said, frowning at the other vampire. DeLeo simply grinned, flashing those strangely large square teeth. Yes, well, I wouldn't be a proper journalist if I didn't speak my mind. I mean, my darling, who'd give me an interview? He turned my way when he spoke, but I thought it was very strange that he thought it was okay to call me darling. Mr. DeLeo was just leaving, weren't you, George? Vincent said, interrupting me. DeLeo instantly sobered as he bowed in Vincent's direction. Of course, my king.
As he bowed in Vincent's direction.
I thought that's exactly what I said. As he bowed in Vince's direction. I guess I slurred it a little bit, didn't I? Leaving, weren't you, George? Vincent said, interrupting me. DeLeo instantly sobered as he bowed in Vincent's direction. Of course, my king. He turned to us and bowed deeply toward Castor. It was a great pleasure meeting you, Prince Castor. When he also turned and bowed to me, I nodded my head. I still found it so weird when someone acknowledged me in that way. I'd spent my entire working life as a servant, and nothing had prepared me for the way people would treat me once I became Castor's mate, the king's junior valets. I don't know how to say these names.
Mohsen and Amir.
It prepared me for the way people would treat me once I became Castor's mate. The king's junior valets, Mohsen and Amir, now looked sideways at me and did the whole bowing thing when I walked into the room. I found it thoroughly disconcerting to be treated so deferentially. Sideways at me and did the whole bowing thing when I walked into the room. I found it thoroughly disconcerting to be treated so deferentially. I found it thoroughly disconcerting to be treated so deferentially. I like that delivery. I found it thoroughly disconcerting to be treated so deferentially. It was such a pleasure to meet you, Emery. I do hope we will meet again soon. Until then, I'm off. George DeLeo made a grand sweeping gesture with one arm and then disappeared in the blink of an eye, reappearing at the side of the V&N van where he opened the door and climbed into the front passenger seat. The van started up, and I watched it back down the driveway, followed by the other vehicles with dark tinted windows carrying the vampire workers. When they were gone, Castor turned to our hosts for the afternoon. He's really an interesting vampire, Castor said. The man is a caricature, Vincent said with a half-smile playing around his full lips. Rome snorted. You can say that again. Please come inside. Vincent can get you a drink while I start the barbecue. He held out his hand toward the house, and we all headed across the lawn toward the cabin. Vincent's cabin was a clean, warm space decorated with several antique furnishings. Though I'd never been inside, Castor had told me Vincent owned an antique store in town. He'd clearly moved several pieces into his cabin. It made for a beautiful and upscale place. I noted the thick Persian rugs on the floor, but what I found most intriguing was the massive metal shield and huge broadsword hanging over the fireplace mantel on the far wall of the room. The 6-foot-long sword was longer than I was tall, and I couldn't imagine anyone being able to lift it, much less swing it in battle. I had no idea where Vincent had gotten it, but I knew there had to be a story behind it. Vincent is a knight of the realm, born more than 700 years ago, Castor told me telepathically. I glanced up sharply to find him staring down at me, watching my reaction as he read my mind. I can't believe I never knew that. Castor smiled at me. He's been around. What can I get everyone to drink? I turned to find Vincent watching us over the raised counter where bar stools separated the kitchen from the great room. The smile he wore on his handsome face was welcoming. I'd liked him from the first moment I met him. Do you have tea? I asked. I have whatever you'd like, he replied. I thought you might prefer something from the homeland, so I put some chai on. I glanced past him at the samovar.
Samovar.
Samovar. I thought you might prefer something from the homeland, so I put some chai on. I glanced past him at the samovar he had set up on the 6-burner stove before looking back at him with surprise. You know how to make Persian chai? I'll have that if you don't mind. Vincent nodded. Of course. He glanced over at my mate. Castor, I'll have the same. Thank you. Very well. I watched him pull several delicate blue glasses out of the cupboard. Persian tea was a very aromatic version of a tea resembling strong Earl Grey. Some people added a few drops of rose water. My mother preferred to prepare it in this manner, so I'd learned how to make it when I was just tall enough to see over the stove. Violet, my mate's sister, had a large and beautifully crafted samovar set up in the parlor back home. It was plated with 24-karat gold over hand-carved pewter and was probably worth a fortune. I'd never seen one so beautiful, and if I had to guess, it was an antique. That type of samovar was found in wealthy homes throughout the Middle East and Russia. Vincent's utilitarian samovar on the stove consisted of stainless steel pots set one on top of the other, but they were highly polished and gleamed from the stove. I watched in fascination as Vincent prepared the hand-painted blue glass tea glasses. Should it all be together? Vincent prepared the hand-painted blue glass tea glasses? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Top of the other, but they were highly polished and gleamed from the stove. I watched in fascination as Vincent prepared the hand-painted blue glass tea glasses and was charmed when he put them on a tray, along with a dish of sugar lumps, and thoughtfully tiny golden spoons. Silver-burned, we werewolves.
Stop. Tiny gold spoons.
How do you say this next word?
Zulbia.
Zubia?
Zulbia. Zul.
I'm Zul.
Yes,
I'm the
that.
gatekeeper. All right,
Zulbia.
Zulbia. As Vincent prepared the hand-painted blue glass tea glasses and was charmed. As Vincent prepared the hand-painted blue glass tea glasses and was charmed when he put them on a... As Vincent prepared the hand-painted blue glass tea glasses and was charmed when he put them on a tray along with a dish of sugar lumps and thoughtfully tiny gold spoons. Silver-burned, we werewolves. When he added Zulbia, a small oval sweet cake soaked in honey syrup, to a dish of the same blue glass to the tray, my mouth started watering. Clearly, either Vincent had been in a Persian home before, or he'd done some research to find out what we liked when tea time came around. Let's have a seat at the table where we can enjoy our tea and talk about what's going on, Rome said. Vincent put out some Persian snacks if you're hungry. He pointed to the dining room table, and I noticed the Lazy Susan, which had 2 kinds of yogurt salads. All right, here we go. Miss Trebek,
Mastochiar,
Okay.
Mastomusir.
Mastochiar and another Mastomusir. And I noticed the Lazy Susan, which had 2 kinds of yogurt salads. One had cucumbers and mint and was called Mastochiar, and another, Mastomusir, had shallots. Accompanying it was a selection of lavash.
Lavash.
Mastochiar, and another, Mastomusir, had shallots. Accompanying it was a selection of lavash, a flatbread, and pita bread, shelled walnuts, feta cheese, fresh greens called sapsi. Okay, what's that one?
You said it correctly.
Good. I lucked out there. It was a selection of lavash, a flatbread, and pita bread, shelled walnuts, feta cheese, fresh greens called sapsi, basically a selection of cilantro, basil, and other vegetables, rounded out the tray. I smiled as I took the chair Castor pulled out for me, sliding into a chair upholstered with a smooth, dark chintz. I knew my fabrics from the days when my mother used to take in sewing for the rich aristocrats back home. She'd taught me so many things I'd tucked away in my adolescent memory, surprised that they'd turned out to be useful now that I lived in a beautiful home with my mate. I slept in a massive bed sitting on a raised platform, sliding around on silk sheets and draped with rich velvet curtains. Being Castor's mate definitely had its perks, aside from the fact that I loved him deeply and knew he was devoted to me. Castor immediately reached for my hand once he'd settled himself into the chair beside mine. I found it fascinating that he rarely, if ever, let me sit alone in a room. It was as if he always needed me by his side within touching distance. He stood close to me in a room, sat on the couch with our legs touching, or simply slung an arm around me whenever I was near. I adored how much he wanted me, and found every bit of it charming. I never denied my beloved anything. How could I? He was my fated mate, the one man Mother Nature had fashioned only for me. I still marveled at the miracle that we'd found each other, when most fools never found their mate. I was the luckiest man in the world. "Well, why don't you tell us what's going on in this part of Prosper Woods?" Castor said. "Then we'll fill you in on what we know about the troubles we're facing with..." "What's going on in this part of Prosper Woods?" Castor said. "Then we'll fill you in on what we know about the troubles we're facing from Alistair McCurdy and his clan." I immediately sobered, wanting to know what Castor was planning when it came to the threat we faced from his former fiancé's father and the clan McCurdy in Scotland. I knew Castor's decision not to go through with his betrothal to Penelope McCurdy wasn't one he had relished making, not when the result promised to be war between our clan and the Scots. In the end, though, Castor told me that it had been the only decision he could make once he had met me. Not when the result promised to be war between our clan and the Scots. In the end, though, Castor told me not when the result promised to be war between our clan and the Scots. In the end, though, Castor told me that it had been the only decision he could make once he had met me. Not when the result promised to be war between our clan and the Scots. In the end, though, Castor told me that it had been the only decision he could make once he had met me. Vincent handed me a tea glass, and I smiled at him. He nodded at me, returning my smile as he held out a second glass to Castor. "Once I got into the daily running of the vampire world, I realized that it's a complicated business. I think everyone thought things were running smoothly when the Conclave of Eight world. I realized that it's a complicated business. I think everyone thought things were running smoothly when the Conclave of Eight ran things. That hasn't turned out to be the case." "Really? What's been going on?" Castor asked. "Well, a lot, really," Vincent said. Castor asked. "Well, a lot, really," Vincent said. "The Conclave had the vampire world divided into 8 geographical areas around the world. Each one of them was responsible to govern their given area, or territory, as they called it. What we found was that they basically taxed vampires to high heaven and didn't provide much return on their investment. Unwinding the graft of the officials in charge, the corruption and downright theft, has been a bloody business. The corruption and downright theft has been a bloody business. The corruption and downright theft has been a bloody business, our friend said with a frown. I watched Rome reach over and take Vincent's hand before looking back at us. What my mate means is that he's had to carry out some sweeps to weed out the corrupt individuals in charge and assert his power as king, Rome said. Rooting out the bad guys and dealing with them has been the greatest challenge, but he's done it well. It's taken some travel and time away from me, but now he's home, having cleaned out the last nest of corruption in Asia just last week. The way Rome gazed at his mate with pride made me swallow thickly. Sometimes Castor looked at me that way, and it never ceased to amaze me. I'm proud of him. Rome raised their clasped hands and kissed Vincent's knuckles. There was an awkward few seconds before Vincent cleared his throat and looked back at us. There was an awkward few seconds before Vincent cleared his throat and looked back at us. Yeah. There was an awkward few seconds before Vincent cleared his throat and looked back at us. Yes, well, it was a mess, and I'm happy it's over and done with. I've appointed 6 new governors, leaving only 2 of the original in place to round out the 8 geographical territories. I think those 2 might be salvageable, but they're under intense scrutiny by those I trust. They know what the consequences will be if they don't fall into line and enact the new laws, Vincent said. Don't fall into line and enact the new laws, Vincent said. Don't fall into line and enact the new laws, Vincent said. The consequences will be if they don't fall into line and enact the new laws, Vincent said. Let's just say it involves decapitation and rivers of blood. The vampire grinned, and I expected to see fangs. Thankfully, there weren't any present, most probably in deference to us. You've had to draw up new laws, Castor said, clearly disturbed by Vincent's troubles. I had a feeling he was going to have a sit-down with his own father about werewolf laws once we got back home. New laws, Castor said, clearly disturbed by Vincent's troubles. I had a feeling he was going to have a sit-down with his own father about werewolf laws once we got back home. The very idea of what Vincent had to do to restructure the vampire world seemed daunting. I couldn't imagine what Castor would have to go through, and since politics in the werewolf world were totally foreign to me, I could only hope my mate didn't run into the same types of troubles once McCurdy and his clan were defeated. I really hope the old mate didn't run into the same types of troubles once McCurdy and his clan were defeated. I really hope the old king, Castor's father, had things well in hand, but I worried about him. He wasn't a well man, and if he'd let things slip as his illness weakened him, things might be worse than Castor imagined. There was always a possibility that Teo had been influencing him in a negative way. I had the impression King Howard's a day. There was always a possibility that Teo had been influencing him in a negative way. I had the impression King Howard Saday's... I can't spit and do that. There was always a possibility that Teo had been influencing him in a negative way. I had the impression King Howard's... See, it just hits too fucking hard. There was always a possibility that Teo had been influencing him in a negative way. I had the impression King Howard Saday's former head of security had been instrumental in pushing him into hiring matchmaker Arliss to arrange his betrothal to Penelope McCurdy. I hadn't trusted Teo from the moment we'd met in the castle back home in Tabriz, and it had nothing to do with the way he'd been pressuring me into a sexual relationship with him. It just might have been my natural werewolf instincts telling me that the man was dangerous to the crown. I really hoped I was wrong, but Castor might have a bigger mess to clean up than he imagined. I reached out and took a hard sugar lump, tucking it into my cheek in the Persian fashion before sipping my tea, reveling in its delicious fragrance as it slid down the back of my throat, taking the sweetness of the melting sugar with it. "Thank God I met a scholarly fellow who was willing and able to help," Vincent said, dragging me back to the topic at hand out of my wandering thoughts. "You might have seen him the night the conclave put me on trial. He spoke on my behalf." "Oh, the young vampire?" Castor asked. I had no idea who or what he was talking about, since all of this predated my time in Prosper Woods. "Oh, the young vampire?" Castor asked. I had no idea who or what he was talking about, since all of this predated my time in Prosper Woods. Castor had explained that the Conclave of Eight were ancient vampires who'd ruled the vampire world for millennia. Apparently, some ancient books belonging to Vincent's sire revealed Vincent was their king, and afterward he had done away with the ancient and evil conclave in a bloody fight taking place right here in Prosper Woods. I only knew about it because my mate admitted to having participated in the battle along with Violet and Alpha Greg. I'd gotten actual proof that my mate was a hero, but then again, I'd sensed bravery and valor in him from the moment we'd met. Vincent smiled. "Well, Thiago or Thiago, I forget.
Thiago.
Thank you. And valor in him from the moment we'd met." Vincent smiled. "Well, Thiago isn't young. He looks like a child because he was a child when he'd been turned vampire. He's actually older than I am." "Why would anyone turn a child vampire?" Castor asked. "Been turned vampire. He's actually older than I am." "Why would anyone turn a child vampire?" Castor asked. I could hear the revulsion of the very idea of the practice in his thoughts, but was glad he didn't voice them out loud. Vincent sighed. "Thiago's mother had been turned vampire, and she couldn't bear the thought of being separated from him. She couldn't take the chance that she'd kill him in a hungry fit when his human blood called to her. So she turned her own son?" Castor asked in horror. Vincent nodded. "I'm afraid so, yes." My mouth dropped open. What a terrible choice she'd had. Vincent was the first and only vampire I'd ever met, not counting the ones I'd seen on the driveway when we'd come over today. Learning that he'd been a knight of the realm had been very interesting. I really wanted to know more about his history. Hearing about this child vampire was terrible, and I was suddenly anxious to meet him. I'd always loved to study and read about history. Child vampire was terrible, and I was suddenly anxious to meet him. Nice, Shivka. Child vampire was terrible, and I was suddenly anxious to meet him. I'd always loved to study, and reading about history fascinated me. Meeting vampires who'd lived for centuries might help fill in what history hadn't been recorded in books. More so than that, I wanted to learn more about our own werewolf history. And because I'd asked, Castor had promised he'd have Sir Guillory ship some of our ancient books to California, ahead of moving the whole library, which would occur when the war ended. Castor had written to the scholar and asked him to send a selection of tomes explaining our history, those same books I'd been dying to get my hands on before coming to America. They were supposed to arrive in the States in a week or so, and I was very excited. "What kind of trouble do you anticipate?" Supposed to arrive in the States in a week or so, and I was very excited. "What kind of trouble do you anticipate for Prosper Woods and Frederick?" the sheriff asked. Castor frowned as he looked back at me with a serious expression on his face. He shook his head. "I don't know yet, Rome, and that's the honest truth. I'm in the process of gathering intelligence from a couple of people I have positioned inside the McCurdy clan." "You have spies inside McCurdy's people?" Vincent asked. "Yes," Castor replied with a smirk. "A couple of wolves who once worked for us applied for jobs with their people, and they were hired, fortunately for us." for us applied for jobs with their people, and they were hired. Fortunately for us, I lost my place on the page. For us applied for jobs with their people, and they were hired. Fortunately for us, they've been able to hide their connection to our clan. This was news to me. I hadn't realized that my mate had spies amongst the enemy, but then again, I knew Castor was shrewd. I had to admit that it made sense that he'd sent someone in to act as a spy. In his case, it was two. I was very proud of him and determined to make sure our own security thoroughly investigated our staff as soon as we got back home. I promised myself I was going to see to it that no one working at the house was a danger to my mate or to Violet. It wasn't my place to question security, but it was my place to make sure our home ran like clockwork. I thought that included safety. As soon as I got home, I was going to talk to Clyde, our head of security. "I am impressed, Castor," Vincent said once again, dragging me out of my wandering thoughts. "It is amazing what we have to resort to." Vincent said once again, dragging me out of my wandering thoughts. "It is amazing what we have to resort to in times of war." Castor squeezed my hand, glancing over at me before looking back at our vampire friend. "Well, I just wanted to let you both know how much I appreciate your offers of support. If you don't mind helping me to plan out some strategies that you've had with people in other parts of the world, I'd greatly appreciate it, Vincent. Emery and I are in a bit of a frenzy getting things organized in Iran at the moment, but war is coming, and we have to be prepared for it." "When you say war, what are we talking about?" Rome asked. "I'm a Marine, but I'm positive I have no idea what a werewolf war looks like." "Just as bloody, but without tanks and planes, Rome," Vincent said, frowning. "Guns? Bombs? What are we looking at here?" Rome asked, looking between Vincent and Castor. Rome asked, looking between Vincent and Castor. I held my breath. I'd not thought a lot about what the result of my mating with Castor could be, but now that we were speaking of war, the very thought of people we loved getting hurt made me tremble. Castor seemed to sense my worry as he squeezed my fingers tighter. "Werewolves fight in wolf form, not with guns or bombs, Rome," Castor replied. He sighed, frowning deeply. "And if McCurdy wants to get really nasty, he might attack the human civilian population to draw us out." Fuck me. "This is going to get ugly, isn't it?" Rome asked. I felt for him. He was the sheriff of not only this town, but also Frederick, the town Alpha Greg Brown's pack called home. That meant he was responsible for hundreds of lives, human, werewolf, and shifter combined. Now that there were vampires among us, though, only a small few. Hundreds of lives, human, werewolf, and shifter combined. Now that there were vampires among us, though only a few. Hundreds of lives, human, werewolf, and shifter combined. Now that there were vampires among us, though only a small few, McCurdy might try to use their presence here to stir up hatred of Castor's clan and the royal house of Howardsaday. Every time I say that, I want to... I can do it. Howardsaday. But it's just, it shoots the microphone into a fucking state of oblivion. Try it one more time here. Now that there were vampires among us, though only a small few, McCurdy might try to use their presence here to stir up hatred of Castor's clan and the royal house of Howardsaday. Things looked exceptionally bleaker than they... to stir up hatred of Castor's clan and the royal house of Howardsaday. Things looked exceptionally bleaker than they had when we gathered in Vincent's dining room from where I sat. To stir up hatred of Castor's clan and the royal house of Howardsaday. Things looked exceptionally bleaker than they had when we gathered in Vincent's dining room from where I sat. Castor nodded slowly. I'm afraid my mating with Emery and the rejection of Penelope McCurdy has put us all in danger, Rome. I just don't know what to say.
Has put all of us in danger.
From where I sat, Castor nodded slowly. I'm afraid my mating with Emery and the rejection of Penelope McCurdy has put all of us in danger, Rome. I just don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, my friend, Vincent said. Whenever you tell me you're ready. You don't have to say anything, my friend, Vincent said. Whenever you tell me you're ready, I'll have 100 vampires here to help fill your ranks. You just give me the word. The town shifters are ready to fight, too, Rome said, though I'd hope it wouldn't come to actual war. Castor nodded. I can't tell you what that means to me. I don't know if having 100 vampires here with Greg's pack is a good idea, but I suppose it will address that and lay out the reasons why we should join ranks when the time comes, providing it's necessary at all. He turned to look at me, and for the first time all day I read hope in his eyes and heard it in his thoughts. Emery and I are more grateful than I can say, Castor said, turning to look back at Vincent and Rome. He held out a hand. Thank you. We're here when you need us, Rome said. Please just keep us in the loop, since getting Vincent's vampires here will take some time. I'll put the governors on alert and ask them for a trustworthy... Is that Vincent?
Vincent.
Just keep us in the loop, since getting Vincent's vampires here will take some time. I'll put the governors on alert and ask them for trustworthy souls who might want to volunteer. He suddenly grinned. Since vampires have no souls, I'm pretty certain the ones who do accept the challenge will be the real deal. Castor and I chuckled, and as the other two men took turns shaking our hands, the feeling of overwhelming dread bled away.